Welcome to the Movers Resource Guide podcast, connecting you to the resources you need to create success. We chat with the best vendors, associations, mentors, movers, and more, giving you the information you need to make your moving company the best it can be. I'm your host, Brian Hassan, CEO of Wayfinder Moving in Buffalo, New York, Apex Moving and Storage in Lakewood, Washington, and the president of the New York State Movers Association. Today, we'll be speaking with Tracy Bech, co-founder of Starboard Collectives. Tracy's focus with Starboard Collectives is financial fluency for business owners. She spends a lot of time within the moving industry and moving company owners, helping them understand their finances, plan their finances, and educating them on how to run their companies better from a financial perspective. We're really excited to have Tracy here today. We're going to have a great conversation about the 3 levels of profitability, setting budgets and goals for your profit margins, and the ways you could get more involved in groups that can help increase your financial education to benefit your company. So with that, to increase your financial fluency, here's my conversation with Tracy Bech. All right, well, welcome, Tracy, to the Moving Resource Guide podcast. We're happy you're here. How are you doing today?
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me. I am doing great today. Super happy to be with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're going to have a really, hopefully not super boring conversation about finance. Hopefully we can make it fun and robust and whatnot. So, but we're really excited to hear about how we can keep an eye on our finances better, how we can increase our financial fluency to be a better moving company. So we're really happy you're here. And if you want to kick us off, how do you want to start this out?
Well, I guess one of the things that I always like to start with is that whether you went into business for a product or a service or a craft or a trade that you know how to do, it usually starts there, right? And then the rude awakening that we find once you've been in business for a while is that along with it comes this need for you to also understand finance. So you can't just be an expert in what you do, but you also have to understand some of these inherent pieces of business and the language of business, which is finance. Yeah. And, a lot of this comes intuitively to us because we kind of start to see how it works to be in business for ourselves. And we always try to charge more than it costs us, to provide the service. But then after that, it can happen where your intuition starts to wear off. And we start, getting pulled farther into needing to know some of the stuff about our business finances.
Yeah, at first it seems to be really simple to set some goals and meet those revenue targets when you're, maybe under $500,000 a year or something. And then, you get busier and busier, things get more difficult. And then the expenses just seem to fly out of the woodwork. And then you really just don't understand where you're at sometimes.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to start. It's hard to keep things straight. It's hard to see the forest for the trees. And then, you've got like a lot of profits, but maybe not any cash. And you're wondering how in the world that can be possible. And it just turns into this big, for lack of a more eloquent term, mess, that can be very overwhelming and daunting, intimidating. You pick the adjective.
Yeah. And I think even, especially in this industry, you go through this whole winter where you're either breaking even or losing money. But, movers are typically not doing super well through the winter. And then we get to spring where it's finally like, hey, things are getting better. And if you're doing any military moving or long distance moving or some other things, your business may increase prior to your cash flow increasing. So it's like things went from bad to worse heading into spring. So it can be very difficult.
Yeah. And you're wondering how in the world is this possible that, I have all this work and I have all these profits, but I have no cash. Yeah. And how are we going to continue on this trajectory? What's the answer? What's the way out of this, non-virtuous cycle? How do we flip that around and make it a less painful process?
Yeah, and luckily we have you. So hopefully we can get some great information and insight on that.
Yeah, exactly. And, I have to preface all of this by saying that I'm not a mover, but I've started and run and sold 2 businesses of my own and do not have any formal training in finance. So all of these things that I teach, I've learned the hard way. And I always say, like, it's the best way to learn something because you'll never forget, the
Painfully.
answer. Yes, but it's the most painful way. And, at 60-Minute CFO, it's a partnership between my dad and I, and my dad has always been a business mentor to me. He has the BA and the MBA in finance, and he's learned in all of this stuff from academic institutions, but he'll also tell you that, unfortunately, even if you do come out of school with an MBA or, a degree in finance, it still doesn't necessarily prepare you for the road ahead when you start a business. There's a very distinct difference, right?
Yeah. And I will say, a lot of people don't know this about me, but I have an MBA. And when I started our first moving company, it was embarrassing what I didn't know, even though I had an MBA. I can read financial statements. I could do a lot of things. I probably would have done fairly well in the corporate world. But when you go to run your own business and, the accountant looks at you cross-eyed when you submit your tax documents the first time, because she's like, oh my God, this is a mess. And, it's just a whole different world. Was not prepared really to be a business person with an MBA. So at least on the small business owner side of things, right? So I've had to learn all those hard lessons too, even though I thought I paid for the education to get there. So
right. I know, it's so hard.
And maybe if you don't mind, since you brought up your dad, I think it would be a great introduction for people who know 60-Minute CFO and some of his work. Can you give us a quick intro on where all this knowledge and learning came from with you, besides through your businesses?
Yeah. So my dad is David Duryea, and he wrote the first versions of 60-Minute CFO, and he has a long line of a track record of working with the moving industry and consulting, and then forming best practice groups, and speaking at conferences, and really getting to know movers and moving in particular, the industries and the formula, the ratios and the benchmarks and things. And he was writing the 60-Minute CFO just as I was selling my second business, and had just gone through like a real crash course in like I mean, it's like, if I thought selling my first business was an MBA, the second one was like a PhD. I was just like, whoa, I didn't know what I didn't know. And when he started to, I sold my business, and I wasn't working on anything else in particular. In fact, I was like trying to take a much delayed maternity leave. I just had my second kiddo. And he said, well, you're not doing anything. Why don't you help me market my book and sell my book? And that's what you know how to do. And I was like, okay, sure. Right. Yeah, I'm not doing anything, but I'll help you. And in doing so, I realized that I didn't just want to market the book, like that this book was like the book. It was exactly it's funny how timing is, but like he had come at it from his whole experience as a consultant, but also having had an MBA and a BA in finance, but then working with, business owners, and many of which were movers. And he had just kind of written this like perfect summation of everything that you need to know to keep things simple and actionable and really understandable, right? In the realm of finance in your business. And I just kind of quickly went from wanting to market the book to just teaching the book, because I was like, I just lived this. Like, how did you know?
Yeah.
And I learned it all the hard way. Where was this book 3 years ago?
Right. I think that's fantastic though, because your dad was really great for the moving industry, helped a lot of people, and a lot of people know him. And I think he's at least mostly retired at this point. So luckily we have a great replacement for him, with you, very knowledgeable. So we get to continue that education, and you get to continue his legacy, which is awesome. So, but with that, so let's talk about the P&L. What are some things that we should be paying attention to with the P&L and taking a look at? Okay.
So the P&L, the income statement, is truly, I would bargain that I would wager that almost everyone listening has an intimate knowledge of their P&L, because as business leaders and owners, it's where we see our revenue and where we see our profit. And I think those are two words that are super synonymous for being in business, right? Like, what's your revenue? What's your profit? Like, we can understand those terms. They're not intimidating. But what's interesting is that a lot of times people are managing by the top line and the bottom line, which is to say revenue and net profit. Okay.
Yeah.
But there are two more levels of profitability outside of net profit that are super important and can be huge game changers when specifically movers start to understand what those are. And I will say 9 times out of 10, when I look at an income statement from a mover, what I see is they say, well, my revenue is the same as my gross profit because we don't have any cost of goods because we're a service. We're a service.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
And I've had this discussion and argument with people like, even though you're a service, you do have costs of goods sold.
You do have costs of goods. Exactly.
So what would those be?
Okay. So cost of good is anything that's directly related to producing a move. Right. So it's the labor that you would have to hire in order to move, make a move happen. It's the vehicle operating expenses on the move. It's the packing material on the move,
Okay.
the handling, right? So it's anything that like we got to pay these people or for these things in order to make a move, right? Just on the most basic forms. So in the moving world, those are your costs of goods.
Yeah.
Right. And go ahead.
No, I was going to ask, so maybe to give some people some tangible things with this. I know that you've worked with movers for so many years and you kind of have an understanding of this. So you gave us a great list there of the things that belong in costs of goods sold. But, to take something away from that, okay, we've got those numbers in there. What am I supposed to be seeing once I take that off of my revenue? So I take my revenue minus my cost of goods sold. Where should I be? Or where are successful movers at that point? Right.
So keep in mind, this is going to be the most important margin that you measure, right? It's going to be your gross profit margin. So your gross profit margin is everything after you've paid for everything it takes to actually do the move, right? And
it was an internet stutter.
Oh, okay. 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 No worries. Okay, so the gross profit margin is going to be the most important margin that you measure, right? So it's going to be your the amount of money that you have left over after you pay for your direct expenses.
Yeah.
And in general, what I see is for movers, depending on your business mix, right? Like if you have, depending on the types of moves that you're doing, if you're more military, more office and industrial, more local household goods, international, it can run the gamut. There's different margins attached to each one, but generally speaking, 25 to 50% should be your gross profit margin.
So that's a pretty big gap depending on those things. If we were to say, and I would think the majority of movers in the country are probably smaller local movers, right? So if we were talking with them, I would think that margin would be on the higher end, right?
Yeah. 45. Okay. 48, 51.
Okay.
And so those are some really great targets. Now, what you're going to want to do is take, a look at what it's been for you, and you're going to start to understand what's good for your company, right? Because I'm giving you very general ballparks. So, but we need to know what it is, and we need to measure it and use it as a target.
Awesome. I like it. Okay. Yeah. So we now know what to do with our gross profit margin. What's next? What's the other number we're not looking at that we should be?
Well, so next is everything else, right? So think about it this way. If you want to be more profitable and your gross profit margin is too low, even if you start earning more money, you're going to have to spend all that same amount of money because it's all the same amount of money. You have to spend that money in order to make the move happen.
Right.
So we want to optimize gross profit margin first. And then what we have left over is everything else, right? It's our office manager, it's our advertising and marketing, it's how much we pay for accounting and legal and travel and entertainment. And all of those are our operating expenses.
Okay.
And operating expenses, those things we can optimize as well. And we want to make sure that we're looking at, how much they are and monitoring and budgeting and things like that. And those things we have a little more control over, right? Because you can decrease some of your operational spend as necessary. If some things you can, some things you can't. But
Right.
some things are a little more discretionary than others. And
Yeah.
what I typically see, and this one runs the gamut. But on the low end, we would see an operating profit margin of about 8%. And on the higher end, maybe like 15, 17, 18.
Okay.
Again, depending on the size of your company, how many branches you have, where you're located, rent is different across different geographies and things like that. So,
Yeah, and I would assume that the larger organizations with higher overhead would have a lower percentage there,
yeah.
and maybe smaller organizations with one location and smaller overhead, if they're doing well with that, would be on the higher end.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And remember, sometimes people have artificially inflated operating profit margins depending on what types of, familial relationships we have in the company, who's on payroll, who isn't really necessarily, doing as much work as others. Like these are just like, common things that I've seen. I just want to make sure we all know that.
For sure. Okay. Excellent. So, and I think you were telling me at one point, that's when we look at operating profit margin versus net profit margin, the world kind of looks at net profit margin as the be all end all. That's the most important number of anything. It's not how much you make, it's how much you keep. But in the relationship between the operating profit margin and the net profit margin, talk about that a little bit.
Well, yeah. So think of it this way. It's kind of a waterfall effect. So everything that you can preserve as close to the direct, gross profit margin as possible will trickle down to the net profit. So like if you decrease your direct expenses, your cost of goods by 1%, and you don't change anything else in your business, that 1% will trickle all the way down to the net profit margin.
Right. Yeah.
And same thing on the operating profit margin. If you go through 10 line items on your P&L and reduce each one by 1%, that will trickle down to your net profit margin and increase your net by 10%. So yeah. It's a great way to have a more direct impact on the bottom line. So many people, if they're just managing by the bottom line, they're skipping over some of these clues, these contextual clues, that are hidden in their numbers and the way those expenses behave. And when we think about it in terms of, what are our costs of goods and what are our operating expenses, we start to get way more targeted and way more tactical and strategic with how we can increase the net profit.
Right. Which is how much we take home. Right. So
yeah, exactly.
But all the heavy work. And I think what you're saying in that is, a lot of times there's not a heck of a lot we can do with the direct expenses, our costs of goods sold. Like, yes, we might be able to manage it a little bit. There are things we can do, but where you can really get to work and make some changes is in that operating profit margin. And that's where you can have the most effect. Would that be correct?
Well, sure. And then remember that there may still be some things that you can do in your cost of goods, your direct expenses. There may be, so don't assume that everything is super buttoned up there.
It's probably not, right?
Yeah. And then the other piece of that is don't forget about revenue and pricing. So if our gross profit margin is off, there's two components there. There's how much we charged for the job and how much the job costs. So we may have a pricing problem. We might be undercutting ourselves or discounting too deeply and not hitting our margin for that reason.
Yeah. And I think that sometimes movers kind of check out the market and price that way, or feel that they look at their own pockets and say, well, I couldn't pay for more than this for moving, so I can't charge more than that. And I think that, we definitely have to shop the market and understand what the prices are in the market. But I also think that what we lose sight of sometimes is we actually have to price ourselves based on what our costs are, so that we can make money that way. And I think that the moving industry has kind of fallen short over the last couple of decades on that.
Yeah. It's a tough one. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. Really,
Sorry.
right? Because it's a mindset as much as it is anything else.
Yeah, for
when you
sure.
start to sort of sell yourself short before you've even sold the job.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, your guys still want to be paid their wage, whether you priced
Yeah.
it high or you priced it low.
Right.
So that's just it's just a truth that we have to
Yeah.
recognize.
Okay, so that was a really good kind of summary of the P&L and what we should be looking for. I guess the next step is what tips do you have for us on how to manage that?
Yeah, so it's not complicated, right? And we definitely believe in keeping things as simple as possible. So once you understand what your margins are, and you want all three, you want your gross profit margin, your operating profit margin, and your net profit margin. If you're happy with them, that's great. If you're not happy with them, we need to set a goal for what we want them to be. And once
Okay.
we know what those numbers are, we need to communicate it, right? It can't just be one person who knows this information, and because no one else can help you with that, right?
Right.
So the front line, sales needs to know. Sales needs to
Okay.
know what our gross profit margin goal is.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
when they're out there, and they're like, Mrs. Johnson, I'm up against three other guys, and Mrs. Johnson wants, we're competing on cost. Can I throw in, packing materials for free? We know what that would mean to our gross profit margin if we did that.
Right. Right.
It may not sound like a lot, but if it's really degrading the margin, it is. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you're saying then you share what your operating profit margin should, or your gross profit margin should be. And I think I would be comfortable sharing that information. But I would think that some people are a little bit more guarded with that information. What advice do you have on that?
Yeah. Well, listen, think of it as a tool, right? And
Yeah.
when we are teaching our salespeople how to sell, there's so many different aspects of how to do it, right? But one of
Mm-hmm.
them is pricing. And what do we need? What's our break even on a move, right? And for
Yeah.
us, if we don't hit that gross profit margin, we're not making enough money,
Right.
right? So they can go up, up until this point, and after that, they need to have a really solid reason for going below our target
Yeah.
gross profit margin. And we need to know how many times a month that can happen and how low it can go. And it doesn't mean, and it would be important to communicate that is not the money that you are trying to make here isn't just going into your pocket, right?
Right.
Because there's still two other lines of expenses that there's
They
the
get pulled out
operating
of there.
expenses and there's other expenses that are going to hit that. And if you need to even further drill that in, make sure you're pointing out some of the big expenses in the company, right? Like, and let people know, like, this place runs on cash and it requires a lot of cash. Like, we cannot give things away for free.
Yeah. Yes. And it seems to be that there's no denying it's a high overhead industry. I mean, our new trucks anymore are $140,000 plus. It's getting very expensive, a lot of overhead in this industry. So that margin that you're left over with, it can get eaten up pretty quick.
Yeah.
Okay. So we want the salespeople to know, we want to set goals for them based on that gross profit margin, and let them know about it, more or less.
Yeah.
Okay.
A great add-on to that would be, to do job costing, right? So to understand, every single piece of a expense that goes into a move, and have that constantly calculating your gross profit margin on a per move basis. If and until, like, if you don't do it for every move, do it often enough or in different enough moves that generally what it's coming in at.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be a great way to dial it in.
Yeah. And so, like we talked about earlier, I'm sitting here with an MBA. I've read the 60-minute CFO. I've worked with these numbers quite a bit. And I still feel like I'm learning, right? So there's going to be a lot of people listening to this that are like, okay, this is all great, but I'm still confused now. Like, I don't even understand how I can get to these numbers to make my P&L look right, let alone try to understand job costing. So what resources are available to people in the moving industry in general? And then what resources are available through you to kind of increase our knowledge base?
Yeah. Well, so, there's going to be some level of intuition that you have around job costing, right? And you can start there. And whether you're starting with a paper and a pencil and you're scratching it out on a notepad, or whether you want to open up a spreadsheet and start there, I encourage you to just, start to do it in whatever intuitively makes sense to you,
Okay.
to start tracking. But more specifically, 60-minute CFO, we have a moving specific job costing Excel template
Okay.
that is pretty extensive. I didn't personally build it myself, but there's like a lot that goes into it. And
Okay.
it will take you through every box, pad, tape, man hour, truck that you use per job so that you can get your expenses loaded in there and see what you charged for the job and what it cost you. And we'll give you a profit margin per job.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's got to be extremely helpful. I haven't used that personally yet myself, so I might need to get you to email that to me later.
I will. It's on the website as well under resources. So anyone looking for that at 60-minute CFO. But yeah, I mean, I'll email it to you, Brian. And that's a great way because that you could do that for an office move, do it for a local household good move, do it for interstate move, and do it for a military move, and start to see they're probably different margins.
Yeah.
And you'll start to get an average margin, and you're going to start to, that's a great way to back into what the overall margin should be for the company.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think that's fantastic because on a local move, it's pretty easy. You know what your labor is, you know what your costs are, and you see the money right away. So you really understand that. I think when you really get into interstate moving and maybe some office moving, but certainly like with the military, and those costs vary all over the place. And sometimes I think people really just don't understand how good or bad some things are for their business when it's not as easy to see like a local move would be.
Yeah, it starts to get a little muddier for sure.
Yeah. Okay, so outside of these templates and stuff that you have, what else can we do?
Well, so the other thing I encourage people to do is to really involve more people in this process, right? So involve the rest of your company, and then it can be lonely at the top. So when it doesn't make sense to, if you're scratching your head on how to improve profitability within your company, get with other movers, right? Get with movers who are, in your state or maybe across different states. And, Brian, you and I know each other from a best practice group, and get in community with other movers because they have your answers, right? If you are struggling with specific cost or a specific thing that is, bringing down your profitability, you will find the answer when you start to reach out to your community, right? And there's so much to be learned from each other.
I think that's what I find when, I go to a lot of the conferences, whether that be at the state level or the national level, or through our, CEO forum group or whatever it might be. And the presentations are usually helpful and informative, especially when you're new to the industry. But once you get beyond that, the conversations you have with people, and, if you have a specific problem and you're not afraid to be the guy in the room that doesn't know what's going on and you're willing to be vulnerable and ask, like, people are so helpful and will give you those answers. And, that's where much of my growth in the industry has come from. So I agree with you that there's a lot of help within those groups. Specifically, before we end here, just a quick snippet of what happens in a CEO forum group.
Right. So in the ones that I run, we have, a group of movers who don't compete with one another, but who are complementary. And we focus on a lot of peer-to-peer sharing, right? So it's, best practices, goals, and then industry specific timely topics that we need to talk about, whether it's labor or, what have you, right? And then my role is to really bring in the financial piece. So we look at everyone's income statement and balance sheet and the ratios that we can use to tell stories, right? Like your current ratio, your liquidity, safety, your survival score. And we look at profitability across each company, and we can start to understand what's going on here, right?
Yeah. And it's really nice to compare where you're good and where you're not versus the other companies in your group. So that kind of gives you an indication. It's like, okay, I'm okay as a company, but I really suck here. I'm going to start asking everybody else why my numbers here are worse than theirs. And maybe there's something to learn there. And that might be an area that was a blind spot for you before. You didn't even know you were struggling there.
Exactly. Exactly. You could pick on any operating expense, for example, on your income statement and decide, like, that you want to have the lowest cost in that per the group, right? And you start
Yeah.
to get a little bit of a benchmark. It's like, well, I want to shop my insurance, and
Yes.
so how can I get mine to be under 10%? I see that Joe's doing it. I want to do it. Like, so, it opens your understanding of what's possible, and
Yes.
benchmarks that, you can strive for, and,
Yeah.
improve your overall profitability.
Awesome. Okay, so we're pretty much out of time or past time. So, if somebody wanted to just pick your brain, maybe take one of your classes, get remember to or where to download the information, or to join a CEO group, because you're always looking to join ad groups, right? So if they're looking to join a CEO forum or need information from you or want to take any classes, how would they reach out to you?
So my two websites, if you're interested in general financial learning, it would be 60minutecfo.com.
Okay.
And 60 is the number 60. And then if you're interested in a best practice group, it would be Starboard Collectives with an S.com. And then if you just want to chat or whatever, either of those will, send an email to me if you hit the contact us form, or you can find me on LinkedIn, Tracy Bech, Bech, Bech with an H.
That's a good. And then your title would be through Starboard Collective, correct?
Yeah, you'll find
just to
me.
make sure in case there's any other Tracy Bechs out there.
Exactly.
They wouldn't be as great as you, but they might be out there.
I'd love to meet them.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you coming in and helping us understand our financial statements and understand how to learn and get better, and increase our financial fluency. So we really appreciate you coming in, taking the time. Thank you for joining us, and can't wait for everybody else to hear it.
Great. Thanks for having me, Brian.
We really appreciate Tracy Bech joining us here on the podcast. Hopefully the information she gave will be beneficial to you, will be beneficial to your financial fluency. We really appreciate you taking the time to listen to the podcast. Hopefully it's helpful for you. If you have any suggestions or comments that you'd like us to hear, please send us an email at moversresourceguide@gmail.com. Once again, this is Brian Hassan. Thank you for listening. Now go out there and get moving.